What's next for the other big merger, Sinclair Tribune? Washington, more than a year after Sinclair Broadcast Group announced plans to acquire Tribune Media, the transaction is still in the midst of regulatory scrutiny, as the FCC goes through a new round of public comment and the Justice Department has yet to sign off on the deal. The $3.9 billion transaction that would create an unprecedented giant in local broadcasting, as Sinclair would be the largest owner of stations with a reach of almost 59% of the country. McIndelriham, the chief of the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, said on Friday that a competitive analysis of the transaction has been completed, but we haven't reached an agreement with them on what the final agreement will be for antitrust purposes. In April, Sinclair revised its plans to divest some stations as part of its plan to comply with media ownership rules, but that also triggered the FCC to schedule a new period for the public to weigh in on the transaction. With a FCC deadline for comments against the merger last week, public interest groups, some industry trade associations and conservative media outlet Newsmax took aim at Sinclair's latest merger plan, with some calling it a sham and smoke and mirrors. Related, Trump nominates Jeffree Starks to fill Democratic slot on FCC progressive group's launch campaign to break up Facebook. The company argues that its transaction will allow it to invest more heavily in local programming, but critics say that their plan will still leave the broadcaster with influence over many of the stations they plan to divest. A Sinclair spokeswoman declined to comment, but the company is expected to address criticisms of the merger in the coming weeks. The FCC has set July 5 as the deadline for Sinclair's response. At the same time as it seeks approvals for the deal, Sinclair has been a target for media watchdogs, who take issue with right-leaning must-run op-ed segments that air across all of their current stations. President Trump weighed in after a mash-up of different Sinclair anchors reading from the same script went viral. The fake news networks, those that knowingly have a sick and biased agenda, are worried about the competition and quality of Sinclair broadcast, Trump wrote in April. The fakers at CNN, NBC, ABC and CBS have done so much dishonest reporting that they should only be allowed to get awards for fiction. In the midst of all this are some potentially significant changes in the way that the FCC regulates media ownership. A pending court decision could further scramble Sinclair's plans, while an expected FCC vote could offer some relief. Here is where the merger stands, and what could be next. Sinclair Tribune. Under the plan, Sinclair would ultimately own 215 stations in 102 markets. As the Justice Department and the FCC have reviewed the transaction, Sinclair has offered multiple revisions of its station divestiture plan. That is needed so Sinclair can come close to falling within media ownership limits and other rules that govern how many stations an entity can own in one market. Its latest plan calls for divesting 23 stations. It also is seeking to own 2 top 4 stations in Indianapolis and in St. Louis, taking advantage of a recent FCC action that relaxed some of its common ownership restrictions. While we continue to believe that we had a strong and supportable rationale for not having to divest stations, we are happy to announce this significant step forward in our plan to create a leading broadcast platform with local focus and national reach, Sinclair's CEO, Chris Ripley said in April, when its most recent merger plan was announced. Newsmax. One of the highest-profile critics of the Sinclair Tribune transaction is Newsmax, the conservative news outlet whose CEO, Chris Ruddy, has raised questions not only about Sinclair's influence on the divested stations, but about the process by which the FCC has taken to review the deal. The FCC set up another round of public comment on Sinclair's latest divestiture plan, and opponents had until Wednesday to file. Newsmax raised questions about Sinclair's plans to sell stations to Cunningham Broadcasting as well as to an LLC set up to buy one of the biggest Tribune properties, WGN-TV in Chicago. In its filing, Newsmax said that present substantial questions regarding whether Sinclair will actually surrender control of the divested asset and represent sidecar divestitures undertaken solely to circumvent the national ownership cap for which there is no public interest precedent. Cunningham Broadcasting, it noted, was until very recently owned by the estate of Caroline Smith, the mother of Sinclair's controlling shareholders. Voting shares are now owned by Michael Anderson, Cunningham's president and CEO, but non-voting stock is set up in trusts for the children of Sinclair's controlling shareholders. But, as Newsmax notes, Sinclair continues to have other ties to Cunningham, including guaranteeing almost $54 million in debt, according to its latest 10Q filing. Newsmax also takes issue with the purchase of WGN, noting that the sale would be to a newly formed company headed by Stephen Fader, the CEO of Atlantic Automotive Corporation, a chain of auto dealerships. David Smith, executive chairman of Sinclair, holds a controlling interest in Atlantic Automotive. As it has with other stations, Sinclair also plans to enter into an agreement to provide sales and marketing operations to WGN. Newsmax contends that because Sinclair also has options to buy back those stations, the divestitures are sham transactions in which Cunningham and WGN-TV LLC are merely warehouses for licenses Sinclair is not legally able to own. Other critics, the American Cable Association, which represents small and medium-sized cable operators, warns that the transaction will give Sinclair increased power over retransmission consent negotiations and will ultimately drive up the cost of station carriage. The ACA is calling for the FCC to require Sinclair and any purchasers to agree that Sinclair does not acquire or obtain control of the Tribune stations to be divested. The Attorneys General of Illinois, Iowa and Rhode Island said in a filing that Sinclair's plan to sell stations to fall within regulatory limits is indefinite.